Okay, this is a presentation, a brief presentation on doing exposure blending with a single raw exposure. Why do we use raw? Well, the human eye is said to be able to handle, depending on the person, of course, the lighting and everything else, somewhere between 14 and 24 stops. But the big thing about the human eye is extraordinarily adaptable, except when we go from very bright to very dark. We usually don't notice the change in the brightness or anything, particularly in terms of vision. Camera sensors can't cover the human eye, but they're said to do somewhere about 14 stops. I personally think that's a bit optimistic, and so do the experts. More realistically, it's going to be somewhere between 10 and 12 stops. So RAW is covering a good portion of the human eye, but not all of it. The reason that that's an issue is because if you've got a subject with a huge dynamic range, let's say 14, 15, 16 stops, then you're not going to be able to get it all in. So typically we would take, as it shows in the bottom here, we would take 3 exposures, one where the camera says it should be, and then one with a much brighter exposure, typically 1.5, 2 stops, but sometimes 3, and one with a much darker exposure, again, typically somewhere around about 1.5 to 2 stops. Now, if you didn't do that, but you still need to be able to explore the image a lot better than just the image that you've got, RAW gives us, let's say, somewhere between 10 and 12 stops. But if we've taken it in JPEG, that shouldn't say 8 stops, by the way, that should be 8-bit. JPEG has only got 8 bits of information in it. And the way they get that reduced from the RAW to JPEG is by a whole range of things, but one of them is by merging the various shades of certain things. So in the area that we're interested, the extreme shadows or the extreme highlights, it would merge many of the highlights into a single color, perhaps white, and again it would merge many of the shadows into a single color, which may be black. So the information is actually lost in JPEG, but it's not always in RAW. So let's go and have a look at a RAW image. I did 3 shots for a conventional image blending, but it didn't work out, and there's a number of reasons for that. Here's the actual image, one of the images that I took of the 3. Takes a look, there we are. And there are a number of reasons why it didn't work too well. One was the high volume of movement. If you look up the top here at this flag, even in this exposure, which is only, it's, what is it, 2.5 seconds, the flag is highly mobile. But not just that, these trees were extremely blurred when I tried to merge 3 images. So I picked what was the best of the 3 that was suitable for single exposure blending. And if we look at it, we can see, remember, when you look at a RAW image with any viewer, as far as I can tell, always, but let's say most of the time, you're looking actually at the embedded JPEG within the RAW. You're not looking at the raw data, you're looking at that embedded JPEG. Now, if we look at that embedded JPEG, and that's quite easy to do, if we do a look at the EXIF data here, you can see on the histogram, this one, as you'd expect, is well exposed to the left. And it's just about, you can see that it is just about a sliver of light down there. And at the bottom, it goes off, which we can't see. Now, the problem with that is the fact, don't forget we're looking at the JPEG, but because I know the camera that I'm using, and I've tried this on a number of occasions, I know I've got 1.5, maybe 2 stops that I can't see in the JPEG, which is in the RAW. You can get an idea of what's there just by experimenting with this, because this piece of software will push it further and further, and it will also include what's over there. But you can see that if I just do simple adjustments, there is detail in the black shadows. Doing this is obviously not a good plan, because you can see it now looks like a sort of a semi-daylight picture, and the colors are awful. But what we're doing is just exploring what we've got in information. The other disadvantage I found when I did this is suddenly I could see all of this works down here, which on the day when I was there, it's just such a wonderful view. You don't often see these sorts of things. I can also see the scaffolding where they were doing maintenance or repair work under the bridge, and you can see all this scaffolding. Obviously, something's got to be done with that when I get round to it. And because the scaffolding is covered with tin sheeting, then it got reflections off of the sunlight over the sunset from over here. So this is the image that I'm going to use. To use it, it's actually quite straightforward. Essentially what we do is we drop it into our raw processor of choice. I happen to use Photoshop in this particular example. So I'll just drop it into Photoshop and it will power up. As soon as it loads, it will power up in the Adobe Camera Raw processor. Now, because I've got what's called clipping enabled, you can see that according to this, there's clipping on the right, on the shadow side, and all of this blue here is where the image has been clipped. That means that while there is detail there in the raw, it's completely been merged into a single color, which is almost certainly black. So what do we do with this? Well, first thing I normally do is I go down to take out any of the profile corrections. So what I do is I'll enable profile corrections to get rid of any problems with the lens. This happens to be a 24-105, so it's taken out those. And just in case there's any chromatic aberration, I'll take that out as well. Then at that stage, I've got the basic image that I want to work to. It's quite common these days, and I quite like it myself, but sometimes I tend to overdo it, to put a little bit of magenta into a nighttime shot. It it gives it a little bit more sort of color definition in the night sky, if you like that sort of thing. You don't have to do that. This is now where we're starting from. We now want to create 3 images which have different exposures. At the moment, the exposure is as shot in the camera. Well, we need one of those. So what we'll do is we'll save one of those as it stands. Just to explain this is the save dialog for Adobe Camera Raw. Because I'm going to be working in another application and I'm going to move these files to that other application, I always do use TIFF to make sure that I don't lose anything with the transfer. This application doesn't accept Canon RAW files, so it's got to be either TIFF or JPEG. I use TIFF because TIFF doesn't lose any of the data like JPEG does. I've set it up for Adobe RGB, and if you can just about see it down here, I've set it up for 16-bit. The camera doesn't support 16-bit, but it does support a lot more than 8. So what we're trying to do is preserve as much data when we export as possible. Basically, we don't want to lose anything. We do at the end, but we don't want to do it in the middle. So we're just going to save that one, and I will give it a suffix of 0 to say, whoops, 0 to say there's no change. I save that one. Now watch the histogram up the top here, and I will now just change the exposure. I haven't changed anything else. We don't want to change anything between exposures, and I'm going to do it as if I was taking this in the field in the camera, and I'm going to go to 1 + 1.5 stops. This image actually probably only needs 2 pictures, but I'm doing 3, so it emulates what would happen if I did it in camera. You can see I've still got some of the shadows which are burnt out, but in addition, I've also got highlights burnt out now. That doesn't matter, I'm not particularly interested in that. What I want is that exposure, so we now save that one off. Now this one is + 1.5. So I'll make that + 1.5. And now we want one for completeness of -1.5. So we'll bring the exposure down from + 1.5 to -1.5. And again, obviously, we've got a lot more detail that is now clipped off at the bottom edge, which means we got blocked in. But we save that, and we've then got our 3 images. At that point, we finished with Photoshop because we just wanted to get to the raw. So we cancel that, and then we can just exit. And for convenience, I stored them in here. Here's the 3 TIFFs. There's +1.5, as shot, -1.5. And a quick look at those, we'll see that those will be, there's the +1.5, there's the as shot, and there's the -1.5. Now at that stage, I'm going to use an application called Photomatix. This is an old version. I've got the latest one, but I'm very familiar with this one, so that's what I'm using for this demo. And Photomatix doesn't do much. All it actually does is exposure blending and HDR. It doesn't do much, but what it does extremely well. There are lots of applications that do this now. This was one of the earliest ones, and like anything else, once you're used to it, you don't bother to change. So let's power up. And we just want to load our bracketed photos. We're just going to pick up those 3 TIFFs. And the 3 are just in there. So now I can just do OK to open them. Now it's recognized that the 3 images have actually got the same EXIF data. The fact that I changed the exposure and then saved them off to something else, it still carried forward exactly the same EXIF data. So it's made a guess that these are + and -2, which they're not. It's actually + and -1.5. So we make sure it's correct for what it thinks it is. We're going to make that correct. If we'd done different ones, saying this had been +1.5 and that one had been -2, we could have set them individually, but I didn't, because this is sort of emulating what's happening in camera. So we do OK there. It then comes up and asks me if I want to align the source images. If I'd have taken these by hand, then of course I would, but because they were the same exposure, there won't be any misalignment. There won't be any ghost. Ghost is where the typical ghost is someone walking across the frame when you take the 3 exposures and they appear in each of the 3. And what it does is the software will then remove 2 of the 3 if it finds what it terms a ghost. We don't need to do anything with that because there aren't any, because it was done from a single exposure. At that stage, we just hit OK. It merging them to high dynamic range. Fair bit of work. It's a fairly chunky file, but it doesn't take that long. And there we have it. Now, there's a number of things. This is a little bit better, but not a lot better. But we can explore which of we could actually do it by hand over here. But there's a number of points. This one is fully, the histogram is now completely filled from left to right. That's the nice thing about this software. It gives us a number of options, and the one I'm going to pick for this, making sure, because I can do it with exposure fusion or tone mapping. I'm using tone mapping. And if I pick the default, suddenly we've now got an image that we can really work with. Yes, it's going to need a fair bit of work. There's a lot of lean on these towers because I'm low down and they're tall. There's this awful, let me just move that out of the way. There's this awful works area down here where they're working on the bridge. And this is presumably they're running through the night, and this is floodlit. That looks pretty horrible, especially in the foreground, so we want to get rid of that. There's a whole range of things we want to do. There's a van over here parked that I'd like to get rid of as well. And then obviously up here you can see where they're actually working as we speak. It looks as if there's a hole in the bridge, which obviously there isn't, and there's lights where they're working. So there's a fair old bit of work to do, but we've got something that we can work with now. So at that stage, I just tell it to process what I've got. I'm quite happy with that. I don't want to do any more work in here, because after that, I'm going to put it in Photoshop. Now this is actually doing the processing and converting it to what I want. There's the final image, just to see what it's like. You can see there's a lot of detail in there, but there's also quite a bit of noise. So obviously I'm going to have to do some noise reduction as well. But no matter, we've got something we can work with. So let's just save that off. Again, because I'm moving through applications, I will save as 16-bit TIFF because I don't want to lose anything between applications. Whether it doesn't lose anything, does or doesn't lose anything, I don't know. But it doesn't matter because I'm not going to lose anything if I use the maximum settings. So I'll just save that off with the default, and what it does is just saves with the file name of the files that it's done. And at that stage, I've finished with that application. And here's my merged one, tone mapped here. And now what I would do is I would just drop that into Photoshop, and then I start to do my work within Photoshop. And there's a fair bit of work to do, which I'm not going to go through. But what I will do is I show in the best Blue Peter tradition. Here's one I did earlier. I just get the one that I did here. And it's saved as a Photoshop document, and you'll be able to see the layers. Not that I'm going to do anything, but just demonstrate how we get from one to the other. Photoshop documents are pretty chunky, so it takes a little while. And you can see a number of things that are immediately obvious. If I flick back to here, notice the lean in the towers. The lean of the towers is gone. The works I've got rid of. I've got rid of the shine under the bridge. I've got rid of everything along this bottom. I've got rid of the van in the left-hand side. And I put back the darkness in the sky that was directly, using a graduated filter, I put back the darkness in the sky that was directly opposite the sunset. So from a photograph that would have been useless as a JPEG, we went to that one with 3 exposures created with Adobe RAW into Photomatix, and then with a moderate amount of work, or a fair bit of work within Photoshop, we get something that I can quite happily print out and use. Hope that helps. Thank you very much.